The world thought they knew Amy Winehouse. They saw this dazed, drunken singer who, for years, spiraled out of control right in front of our eyes. But did anyone truly understand the price she paid for her fame? Her own success began to turn against her. Paparazzi were relentless, her addictions consumed her, and everyone that should have been caring for Amy just saw her as a cash cow. At the young age of 27, Amy Winehouse joined an infamous club of mysterious celebrity deaths when she died all alone in her Camden home in 2011. Was she pushed to the edge of life by a cruel drug addiction, relentless public scrutiny, and a toxic, all-consuming love for her husband, Blake? Amy was the voice of a generation. Her music moved millions around the world, drawn from the rawest, most broken parts of herself. But she also used her music as a cry for help. On stage, in front of the whole world, she would slur her words and could barely stand up from all the drugs she took. She would even hit herself, trying to snap out of a drug-induced haze. But instead of getting her the help she needed, the world profited from her pain. Photos of Amy high and drunk were spread all across the tabloids. This is the story of Amy Winehouse, the musical legend. But it's also the story of Amy Winehouse, the girl who struggled so badly and called out for help so many times, and the people closest to her that never supported her in the ways that she needed. This series is intended for educational purposes, to document mysteries, historical events, and amplify important conversations. All opinions stated are mine alone. So I've been getting into aromatherapy lately, which is all about how different fragrances and essential oils can literally change your mood. I'm sure we've all heard that lavender helps to calm you down and helps send you to sleep, but I also learned that citrusy scents like orange and lemon can help to energize you and literally uplift your mood. So I've been putting it to the test with some citrusy perfumes, and I'm telling you, I actually think it works. One of my favorite perfumes I've tried is the Forward by Mind Games. It's one of my favorites at the moment because the top two notes are literally lemon and pomelo. And it's a unisex fragrance. It's also got notes of jasmine and wood in there, and I think it is just really nicely balanced. It is really unisex. You know how sometimes perfumes are like, it's unisex, and then you put it on and it smells like my dad? Like, it's not one of those. I've also loved Mr. I don't know how you pronounce this one. It's by Catherine Malandrino, anyway. And the second note in this one is orange zest, and the first note is juicy cranberry. So this one is a very summery, delicious, fruity one. This one's going on holiday with me. But if orangey scents aren't your thing, I have a few other recommendations. If you like a chocolatey sweet scent, then Deck of Scarlet's I'm Expensive is perfect, and it really does smell expensive. And this one's a bit of a wild card, but I've been loving Boyfriend by Original. This one is quite different. When I smell this, I'm in a forest. Like, there's loads of wood, musk, amber, and there's also like a sexy man there as well. I can smell that in here somehow. I've managed to try all these different perfumes that I just talked about because of Scentbird. Oh my god, I love their service. It's a monthly subscription service where you can try out new designer fragrances for just under $17. You get a whole month's supply for you to try out, and it comes in these adorable little carry cases. And the idea is basically that you can try out this month's supply of perfume, see if you get any compliments on it, and then, once you've actually tried and tested it, you can then decide if you want to invest in the full-sized expensive bottle. Gone are the days of having to guess what a perfume smells like just by reading the notes online, and Scentbird has over 700 fragrances for you to choose from. So go explore for yourself. You can either scan the QR code on screen right now, or you can use my code at checkout, 55 Eleanor, which will get you 55% off your first order. So you're basically getting the product for like half price. It's about $8. It's amazing. So thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video and for giving my followers an amazing discount. Now, before we get into this Freaky Friday episode, I do just want to warn you that today we're going to be covering a lot of sensitive topics, including discussions of drug addiction, alcoholism, abuse, and eating disorders, including bulimia. So viewer discretion is advised. And with all that being said, let's talk about the life and death of legend Amy Winehouse. Have you ever heard of an exclusive club that people are literally dying to get into but no one actually wants to be a part of. It's called the 27 Club, and it includes a list of famous celebrities who all died tragically young at the age of 27. And more often than not, these people are at the height of their careers when they die. And while there's no statistical evidence to suggest that more stars die at 27 years old rather than any other age, we can't deny that there is a strange and eerie pattern. The pattern was first noticed by music fans in the 1970s, but it became even more popular with the death of Kurt Cobain in 1994. And then in 2011, when Amy also died at 27, the club got even more attention, and especially because the internet was a thing then, it really became the conspiracy that we know now. People were genuinely starting to wonder if there was some dark, sinister link connecting these famous deaths. The club's first recognised member was a blues musician named Robert Johnson, who was big back in the 1930s. The story goes that Robert was actually terrible at music to begin with. He couldn't sing, he couldn't play the guitar. In fact, the guitar that he did carry around was all beaten up and scratched, and it was like missing a string. And he would play so badly. I mean, he loved playing, so he would keep playing, but people would boo him off stage. People didn't want to hear him. And so one night, he just took off into the night. Legend has it that Robert Johnson walked the lonely roads until he met the devil at a crossroads, and he made a deal with the devil. He sold his soul in exchange for an abundance of musical talent. And sure enough, when Robert returned home to Mississippi and stepped into the spotlight, he played like no other had ever played before. He was incredible. All of a sudden, he rose to fame, his songs were recorded, and he became a musical icon of the era. And he actually still has, I had to check his Spotify. That is such a Gen Z thing to do, but like, how many Spotify monthly listeners does he have? 300,000? Almost 100 years after his death. I think that's crazy. But in order to make such a deal with the devil, you have to pay a high price. And for Robert Johnson, the price of fame would be his life. He died at the age of 27, apparently poisoned by a mysterious stranger. And for the last 90 years, his life and death have inspired the beginnings of the 27 Club conspiracy. It's something I've always found really, really interesting because it combines like all my favourite things. Music, celebrity culture, and spooky weird goings on. So with this episode, we're kickstarting a brand new Freaky Friday mini-series digging deep into the graves of the 27 Club. I want to tell their stories from beginning to end, the tragedies of their real lives and the most sinister aspects of excessive fame and fortune until their untimely demise at the ripe age of 27. And today we're starting with the tragic death of Amy Jade Winehouse, who joined the 27 Club on July 23rd, 2011, after a long and turbulent battle with addiction. She died all alone in her flat in Camden town, the part of London that she lived in and loved the most. Camden was way more than just home to Amy. It was a part of her creative spirit. Camden helped to make Amy famous, and Amy made Camden famous. So when she died, it felt like a wild and free part of Camden's soul died along with her. But her story starts long before she turned the streets of Camden into her own creative playground. Amy Jade Winehouse was born on September 14th, she was a Virgo, in 1983 in Southgate, North London. She was the younger of two siblings. She had an older brother named Alex, and her mum and dad, Janice and Mitch, were both Jewish, and they raised their family that way. Being Jewish was a huge part of Amy's identity, and while her family wasn't necessarily religious, they certainly followed a lot of traditions and they took a lot of pride in their culture. For example, every Friday night, her family would all meet up for Shabbat dinner, which marks the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath, a day of rest. It typically involves lighting candles, reciting blessings over wine or challah, which is the braided bread. I mean, on its most basic level, it is just meeting with those that you love for a meal before the Sabbath. In the Winehouse home, there was always a lot of noise and laughter, and most importantly, music. Amy was born with music in her blood. Her father, Mitch, was a semi-professional singer, and he raised the kids on jazz music, especially Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was one of Amy's very first musical inspirations. She admired his ability to make people feel things through his music, something that she'd never really experienced before. Amy was always singing around the house just like her dad was, and it really didn't take long for her family to realize that she sang like an absolute little angel. Growing up, Amy was a real daddy's girl. In fact, she actually got that phrase tattooed on her upper arm later on in life. She loved her father, but she never really got to spend all that much time with him. Mitch was a taxi driver, you know, those black cabs that are driving all around London. So he was working long hours. Sometimes he wouldn't get home until 11 p.m. And of course, at that point, his kids were already in bed. He barely ever got to see them. Instead of just taking the situation as it is, he was going to change it. But instead of changing his working hours, he changed the kids' sleeping hours, and he would get home from work at like 11 p.m. and then go and wake Amy up to spend an hour or two with her at the end of the day. Amy's mum, Janice, did not like this at all, and I don't blame her. That is quite an unhealthy routine for children. But it was more than just that. Janice felt like Mitch wasn't there for any of the important bits in the kids' day-to-day life. And I don't mean like big important things like birthdays and Christmas. He was always there for those. But I mean those times at like 7, 8 p.m. where the kids would be running around or arguing, and Janice would just be ripping her hair out trying to keep some order in that house. Those are the times where she needed Mitch by her side the most, and those are the times that he wasn't there. Janice found it incredibly hard to tame these two crazy kids, especially Amy. She was honestly quite hard work. She was mischievous, she was bold, she liked being the center of attention, literally like right from when she came out of her mother. After her death, Mitch wrote a book basically about what it was like to be Amy Winehouse's father from start to finish. And he told this story from when she was just 2 years old, right? It was her older brother's 6th birthday party, and everyone was round and obviously celebrating him, and Amy was getting jealous that he was getting all the attention. And so she decided to try and steal the spotlight by putting on a show. She starts singing and dancing and telling people to watch her. And of course, her older brother didn't like this. It's his freaking birthday party. And before Mitch could stop him, Amy's brother Alex had already picked up a cup and dumped a whole cup of drink over Amy's head. She started crying, she ran out of the room, and Mitch described this event as the start of Amy's lifelong habit of attention seeking. He says that Amy just never knew when to stop, and she never knew when it was appropriate. And it wasn't long before the most common thing you would hear in the Winehouse home was, "Be quiet, Amy." But she was just a kid. Just a wildly creative kid who wanted nothing more than to just express herself. Amy was always just being Amy. Unapologetically Amy as well, which is something that later in her life when she became famous, that is something that the public loved about her. Amy had a really nice and seemingly smooth childhood up until the age of about 9. In 1992, her parents got a divorce. And that was because Mitch, her father, had been having an affair for a long ass time. A lot of years ago, when Amy was literally just like 1 year old, he had gotten a second job selling double glazed windows, and there he met this young marketing manager named Jane, who was only 20 years old, 13 years younger than the 33-year-old Mitch, who had a wife and kids at home. But Mitch was willing to throw all that away, and he said that his affair with Jane began when Amy was only 18 months old, and of course, now when he was leaving his family, she was 9. It had been going on for so long. Apparently, Mitch waited so long to leave his wife and leave the family because he was waiting around for his son's bar mitzvah. A bar mitzvah is a Jewish ceremony for young boys to mark their coming of age. It happens when a boy turns 13 years old and he's considered to be old enough to fulfill his religious duties and participate fully in the Jewish community. So Mitch stayed with the family until Alex's bar mitzvah, and then he left. But what about Amy? When a Jewish girl turns 12 years old, she has something very similar called a bat mitzvah. But Amy never actually had one. And I think that was because her father had left. and they no longer had the money or the time, and her mother didn't have the energy. So I'm just left wondering, why was her brother's ceremony so important to their father, but not Amy's? Honestly, I think the whole staying until the bar mitzvah thing must be an excuse for his own cowardly inability to leave his wife for his mistress. Because if it's not an excuse, then that shows that he really just doesn't give a shit about Amy, that he has favoritism when it comes to his son. If he wants to stay for his ceremony because it's important for his son and it's not important for Amy, I think that speaks volumes. It actually turned out that Amy's mother had known about this affair that her father was having pretty much the whole entire time. She had tried her best to make all of this work because it was very clear that Mitch had no plans on ditching his mistress. He actually wanted to keep them both. He wanted his cake, his wife, and to eat it too, his mistress. And so for a while, that was their setup because Janice wanted to preserve her family. They had 2 children and she wanted their lives to remain unchanged. So she put up with the fact that her husband was cheating on her frequently until 1992, when it was no longer her choice. He made the decision that he didn't want to be part of that family anymore, and he left to go off and live with his mistress. Amy was only 9 years old at the time. Her brother was 13, and they just couldn't understand why their dad had left because they'd never seen any of the cracks in the marriage. Of course, they had no idea that an affair was going on, so they thought that they had a really happy, normal family life. They couldn't understand why dad wasn't happy. Clearly, there was a lot of tension behind the scenes that the kids had never seen. Obviously, Janice would have been dying inside trying to keep things together for the kids. But I think it says a lot about her ability to protect those children. The fact that it did seem to come out of nowhere for them means that they hadn't seen arguing and they hadn't seen their mother falling apart, which I guess is a good thing. Amy said that before her parents split up, she was this nice, shy, cheerful kid, but after they separated, she changed a lot. And she became a real piece of work. At 9 or 10 years old, Amy began swearing like a sailor. And I know I can't say anything, but I'm 25. She was 9. She was doing a lot of rebellious things. She started wearing a lot of makeup and wearing mini skirts. And that's what it was, rebellion, teenage rebellion, or preteen rebellion. She was going through that whole teenage rebellion phase really, really young, I have to say. But it was especially easy for her to do all of this stuff now that she only had one parent to argue against. I mean, she did still see her father here and there, but he wasn't in the house day to day now, so it was just Janice's rules. Both of Amy's parents actually took all of this rebellious behaviour as a sign that Amy had coped well with the divorce and that she didn't really care anymore. She didn't seem sad anyway. But I don't agree with that at all. To me, it seems pretty clear that she was just acting out. She was seeking boundaries, subconsciously provoking her parents to yell at her and show her that they care about her. Remember, she was only 9 years old and her parents were letting her get away with things that most kids' mums and dads would not let them get away with. And it might seem cool to the kid in that moment to be able to swear and put on a miniskirt knowing that all the other kids aren't allowed, but really, that's just another way that Amy's mum and dad weren't showing up for her and weren't parenting her. Sometimes kids act out hoping that a parent will get mad because that shows that they care. The truth is, the divorce hit Amy really hard, and you can hear it all over her music later on. She used to say that she would never bother writing a song unless it was about something that she had personally experienced. And when you think about what she went through with her dad and how neglected she probably felt, her lyrics in the song What Is It About Men just hit different. In the first verse, she says, "Understand, once he was a family man, so surely I would never ever go through it firsthand. Emulate all the shit my mother hated. I can't help but demonstrate my Freudian fate." It's like you can feel all of the hurt and all of the betrayal that she felt towards her father when you listen to it, and you get a sense of how hopeless she feels about the whole situation. It's like she's been traumatized by her father's actions towards her mother, and she thinks that it's bound to happen to her too because, well, what is it about men? Her father destroyed the way that Amy saw men and healthy romantic relationships. She never had an example of one. It's not a surprise that Amy's relationship with her father changed a lot after the divorce. Of course, she always saw herself as a daddy's girl. That didn't change as she became an adult, but as an adult, she realised that daddy was far from perfect. Over the years after the divorce, Mitch moved around a lot. He was moving to different cities surrounding London, and sometimes he would dip back into London, but more often than not, he was in like Kent and Essex. Amy said that her dad was a shady kind of man, and she didn't know what he was trying to run from by moving to all these different places. Well, it turns out that Mitch was having some pretty serious money troubles. He declared debtor's bankruptcy a few months after he left his wife in 1993. Debtor's bankruptcy is basically when you file to become bankrupt because you cannot pay all of the debts that are already against you. So Mitch was basically broke and hopeless. But all of that he tried to keep out of the sight of his children, and despite having a weird family dynamic, Amy lived a pretty normal childhood. She started attending a theatre school on Saturday mornings, and this is really where a star was born. Amy really got to flex her creative muscles like never before, and she loved every minute of it. Apparently, her father, Mitch, didn't go to see Amy perform once in the 3 years that she was with that theatre school. But his mother, Amy's grandmother, was always there for her. Her grandmother was named Cynthia, and she was Amy's biggest supporter. She was a lot like Amy, actually. She was unique, she was strong, the life of the party. Amy adored her grandmother, and she learned a lot about music from her, actually. Music really was in the bones of this whole entire family. Cynthia had even dated a jazz legend, Ronnie Scott, for a while. Just imagine the stories that her grandmother would have had and like all the different things she could have told Amy about. The two of them were super close. They were honestly like two peas in a pod. And when she grew up, Amy actually got her grandmother tattooed on her arm, like really big. And I've actually seen some people getting that same tattoo. You know how some fans will get the same tattoo that a celebrity has to be like, oh, we're matching. But like there are actually people walking around with Amy Winehouse's grandma on their arm now, which is random. But anyway, Cynthia became like a stage mum for Amy. She was fiercely protective of her, and she always wanted her talents to shine. And actually, we came across a story where apparently Cynthia had berated this one director for not casting Amy in a production of Annie. But it's okay, because Amy's star moment came in 1994 when she was 11 years old. She was cast as Rizzo in a production of Grease. And seriously, whoever that casting director was, they nailed it. Could you imagine little sassy Amy Winehouse as Rizzo? That is literally the best casting choice ever. And when you see the video of her performance, the acting is like so cute and it's funny because she's 11 years old. But then she starts to sing and oh my God, the Amy Winehouse really comes out of her at 11 years old. It almost doesn't make sense how that powerful voice can come from an 11-year-old. Her talent was so obvious, even back then. But as her talent grew, things at home seemed to be getting worse for Amy. She started being disruptive in class and she would even skip lessons. Her mother was starting to get in trouble with the school and she was honestly going crazy. She didn't know how to handle Amy. Janice and Mitch were in constant communication about what they were going to do with Amy, how they were going to help her. And it seems that Amy felt quite guilty about this. In December 1995, she wrote her father a birthday card that was signed "From your favourite car crash of a daughter," which is kind of funny, and it very much is Amy's style of humour. But in 1995, Amy was only 12 years old, and when you realise that a 12-year-old is calling herself a car crash, it suddenly doesn't seem funny anymore. It's clear that Amy was struggling with something as she was growing into a teenager, but her parents didn't seem to be giving her much help. When she was 13, Amy actually got a scholarship at the Sylvia Young Theatre School in London. It's a very prestigious school with quite famous alumni, including Dua Lipa, Rita Ora, and Daniel Kaluuya. I love Daniel Kaluuya, you know, the guy from Get Out? I love that episode of him in Black Mirror. But anyway, Amy getting a scholarship at this school was such a huge deal because obviously they saw how talented she was and they believed in her potential. But even though people were starting to recognize how much of a star she was, it really didn't help Amy in her own mind. She was very depressed, but but she didn't understand depression at that age, really. She knew that she felt everything very, very deeply, but she thought it was just a musician thing. She continued to suffer internally, and at the age of 14, she was put onto an antidepressant named Cerazette. And it's always slightly concerning when teenagers are prescribed antidepressants. I know it was super hard for me to be able to get them when I was a teenager because they're scared of kind of what it can do to a developing mind, I guess. But there's something particularly alarming about the type of antidepressant that Amy was prescribed. In 2003, a study found that teens that took Cerazette had a terrifying increase in suicidal thoughts and behaviours. Amy herself said that the antidepressants made her feel really loopy, and her parents probably didn't realise at the time that this was the first drug that Amy Winehouse would use to mask her perpetual pain. On this medication, she became numb to everything, both the good and the bad. And later on, she would end up seeking out this same numbness feeling by using harder and much more dangerous drugs. But depression wasn't the only thing that Amy was struggling with. When she was 15 years old, she told her mum, "I have this great diet. I eat whatever I want and then I bring it up." This was the first time that Amy had ever said to anyone in her life that she was suffering from bulimia, an eating disorder that she would end up battling with for the rest of her life. And she only died at 27. That means that almost half of her life was spent being a slave to an eating disorder. But despite Amy saying this to her mum, and obviously Amy didn't realise how serious and damaging this could be. I mean, that's the impression that I get based on the wording that she used. And right there, it should have been Janice's job to sit her daughter down and say, "Darling, that's not a healthy way to go about weight control." But Janice didn't take it seriously. She didn't really help Amy with it at all. In fact, both she and Mitch felt like this was just another one of Amy's silly little teenage phases, something that she would just get over, kind of how they thought she just got over the divorce. But clearly that left a lot of internal scarring. It's just so sad that this child was going through so much at such a young age, and all of these trusted adults in her life don't seem to want to help her out of it. And I don't mean to be rude, but why bother having a child at all if you don't want to help them through life and all of its ups and downs? That is literally what you sign up for when you have a baby. A child doesn't know how to handle anything in this life. It is a parent's job to guide them for at least the first 18 years. And it seems that Amy Winehouse was never really guided on anything by her parents. She was just left to try to navigate massive issues like an eating disorder, depression, the breakdown of her family. She was left to do all of that all on her own at 11 years old, and it breaks my heart. Of course, I'm not a parent, and people don't always like it when I comment on parenting in these kind of videos, but it has to be said that ignoring a problem will not fix it. And that's not even exclusive to parenting and your child's problems. That is as much as true for every part of life. If you ignore a problem, nothing's gonna happen about it. It's only really gonna get worse. Especially issues like eating disorders that only make themselves worse and isolate the person from the rest of their lives. When you hear a child that's starting to display these behaviours of eating disorders or self-harm in any kind of way, that is the moment that you need to act, and you need to let them know that they are supported and loved and that people want to help them. But like I say, Amy never had that. At the age of 16, Amy left the Sylvia Young Theatre School and she briefly attended another very famous performing arts school in London, the Brit School. And their alumni is even more famous than the last. People like Adele, Tom Holland, aka the Spider-Man, people like Jessie J, Rex Orange County, Ray went to the Brit School, and of course, Amy Winehouse. That would have been one of the biggest examples I would have used, but at the Brit School, Amy dedicated almost all of her waking hours to making music. Either she was writing songs or she was playing in a jazz band. And it was around this time that she met a manager named Nick Szymanski. Nick was only 19 years old at the time, so hardly older than Amy, and he had been managing a singer friend of hers, and this friend had shown Nick Amy's demo tape, and as soon as he heard that voice, he knew he had to work with her. But actually, when Amy first met Nick, she couldn't care less about working with him. In fact, she said that he was a total wanker. but eventually he won her over. Nick adored Amy as an artist, and he loved that she was so much more than just an artist. She was a real personality. She never compromised who she was, and that's so rare, even to this day. I mean, it's a bit more common these days, but especially back then in the early 2000s, everyone was like a polished, media-friendly kind of pop star, but certainly not Amy, and she wouldn't let you make her that way either. She was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of talent and kind of performer. So the two of them, Amy and Nick, began working together for a couple of years, and soon they landed Amy her first ever record deal. In 2002, she signed to Island Records for £250,000, which is like $500,000 in today's money. And that is a crazy amount of money to give to an artist that had never been signed before and never, you know, really proved herself before. But clearly that just shows that they saw a lot of potential in Amy. They knew that that investment and taking a chance on her would pay off. And boy, did it pay off. But now, with this record deal money, Amy was finally able to move out of her family home, something that she'd wanted to do since she was like 13 years old. So now that she had that money, she was out. She found herself a place in East Finchley in North London. She moved there aged 19 with a couple of other friends. And for the foreseeable future, Amy pretty much lived on her sofa, smoking weed and writing music all day. On October 20th, 2003, Amy released her debut album, Frank, which is apparently named after Frank Sinatra, obviously one of her very first musical inspirations. For an artist who was only 20 years old, this album was so mature and it was so soulful. It paid a lot of respect to female jazz singers like Sarah Vaughan and Dinah Washington. Amy burst onto the music scene with her iconic towering beehive hairdo, her dramatic winged eyeliner, and her skin-tight leopard print dresses. Yes, I have come Amy themed today. And those tattoos as well. They were so Amy, that like pin-up style. She really just had her own look, her own image, her own aesthetic that no one else was really doing. She really was something new and fresh. She made it clear right from the start that she wasn't going to be just any other pop star that was molded by the industry standards of the time. And apparently her management did try to do that. They did try to polish her and make her a bit more media friendly, but that idea lasted about 5 minutes. They should have known better than to try to tame the Amy Winehouse. But anyway, when the album Frank debuted, it sold over 1 million copies in the UK, and Amy started winning awards for the first time in her life. She won an award for her songwriting on the song Stronger Than Me, which is honestly one of my favourites. But Amy Winehouse was her own harshest critic, and she actually ended up disliking that album, the whole entire thing. But I don't think it was necessarily her part of it that she hated. She hated the fact that her own artistic vision for the album had been muddled with and clouded by all of these non-music people in the industry, like managers and marketing people. Having a say in her art had ruined it for her. Amy herself said, "I hate them fuckers, man. I've not seen anyone from the record company since the album came out, and I know why, because they're scared of me. They know I have no respect for them whatsoever." Look, I know it's a terrible thing for someone to come out and say they hate their own music. It's the worst thing you can do. My album isn't shit. If I heard someone else singing like me, I would buy it in a heartbeat. Amy had such a pure and emotional relationship with music. She needed it almost as if it were a person, and without it, she always felt like something was missing. So, after releasing Frank in 2003, Amy decided to move to Camden town. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Camden was like this giant melting pot for some of Britain's most iconic artists. Imagine, you could walk into any small Irish bar, pack it with ego-filled musicians, loads of alcohol, and probably a bit of cocaine in the toilets, and that's pretty much the Camden that Amy fell in love with. Camden was like Amy's playground, but it was somewhat bittersweet. It kept her creative spirit alive, which was great, but it also exposed her to a world that would eventually consume her, and a hell of a lot of drugs. Her local pub was the Hawley Arms, which is the real-life pub from Baby Reindeer, by the way. I found that out. He didn't actually work in the Heart in Camden. He worked in the Hawley Arms. Amy Winehouse is local. Bit of irrelevant trivia there, but I found it really interesting when I was researching. But anyway, people used to spot Amy at the Hawley Arms all the time. She was tiny, tattooed, drinking her signature cocktail, the Rickstasy. I believe this is something that Amy made up herself, and people have told stories about her like literally walking her ass behind the bar to go and make up the drink herself. And apparently it was 3 parts vodka, 1 part banana liqueur, and 1 part Southern Comfort whiskey. Sounds very strong. But Amy Winehouse became like part of the furniture at the Hawley Arms. Regulars expected to see her there, and of course they didn't freak out when they did because she was just another regular. And that was just how she liked it. She didn't like being treated like she was famous and different. But that slight anonymity didn't last very long. As Amy's fame grew, the paparazzi were obviously following her everywhere, and they realised that the Hawley Arms was one of her favourite places to go. So very quickly they infected that space too. They were always so eager to catch her in her natural habitat. They wanted to catch her really fucking drunk and drugged up. They wanted to snap photos of her looking out of it so that they could create these headlines. Over the years, paparazzi became a huge issue for Amy. She never intended on being a mega celebrity. All she ever really wanted to do was make her music and put it out there and have it appreciated by people. But she didn't want to be a celebrity. She didn't want to be photographed. She didn't want her personal life talking about. And I think that is so fair enough. I think it is such a shame that in order to be an artist, to be a creative and to be successful at it, you also have to offer up your privacy and your personal life. And then whenever these celebrities do complain about the fact that they don't have any privacy left anymore, the normal people come back at them being like, you knew what you were signing up for when you became a celebrity. And not necessarily. Paparazzi following you everywhere shouldn't have to be a byproduct of you playing the guitar, singing along, and putting it out there for people to enjoy. You shouldn't have to sign up your whole entire life. But now, Amy was being chased all over London by men with cameras. They would wait outside the pub to get those really drunk snaps, like I said. But sometimes they wouldn't even wait for her to leave her own damn house. They found out where she lived and they would wait outside, even snapping pictures of her, like leaning out of the window with a cigarette in hand. She wasn't even safe in her own home. The more famous Amy became, the less control she seemed to have over her own image. The Paps had stripped Amy of her privacy, and they threw every part of her personal life under an unforgiving public lens. Amy's love life became almost as famous as her music, with each relationship that she entered getting more attention than the last. But out of all of these relationships, the most infamous and toxic one by far was her relationship with on and off again boyfriend, Blake Fielder Civil. Blake was born on April 16th, 1982, making him just over a year older than Amy. And like her, he also came from a broken home. He suffered from severe depression and started self-harming at the age of 9. Although he has said that he wasn't trying to kill himself or anything, he was actually just trying to get his mum to break up with his stepdad. We tried to look into that a little bit more because I was quite intrigued about like what his stepdad was like, if he was going to such extremes to try to get his mum away from him. But we couldn't really find much of anything other than the fact that he does seem like just a bit of an arsehole. So Blake had this severe depression around the same time that Amy did. 9 years old. That is so young. You very rarely hear of that. What are the chances that 2 people that have been depressed since they were children have managed to find each other? And while both of them were experimenting with drugs and alcohol as teenagers, with Amy it was more weed, and that was about it. But with Blake, he was trying everything as a child. He moved to London at the age of 19, where he was trying heroin and crack cocaine and pretty much anything he could get his hands on. And so by the time he met Amy in 2005, he was able to introduce her to a lot of those really hard drugs that she'd never actually come across before until him. The 2 of them met at a pub in Camden called the Good Mixer. She was 21, he was 22 when they met. She walked in and saw him standing at the bar, and immediately the 2 of them were attracted to each other. The 2 of them played pool together, they were flirting back and forth, they ended up going to another bar and then back to Amy's place. At that time, the 2 of them were actually seeing other people, so they shouldn't have really been getting together, but that was part of it for them. They were both very excited by the other one. In fact, we have a quote from Blake, he thought that Amy was this young, naughty girl, and he was all in for some fun. But Blake very quickly became a really big character in Amy's life after this, well, what was supposed to be a one-night stand. Her friends and her manager Nick said it was very sudden that the two of them became practically inseparable. She never went anywhere without Blake, and she felt uncomfortable if he wasn't there. In Amy's own words, she said, "I fell in love with someone I would have died for." And in a way, Blake's love became the most harmful drug that Amy ever got addicted to. Blake once said, "I like to sabotage myself, and I think Amy liked to sabotage herself too." And I feel like that pretty much sums up their relationship. They became addicted not only to each other, but addicted to a lot of things together. But in August 2005, while Amy was on a girls' trip to Mallorca, she received a text from Blake that changed everything. He told her that he wasn't going to leave the girl that he was seeing for her, and he thought that he and Amy should just be friends. Amy was absolutely devastated receiving these texts. She was frantically texting him back, seeing if there was anything that she could do to change his mind, but there wasn't. But Amy just could not let this go. Over the coming weeks, she was obsessing over his text messages because they were still in contact. She was desperately hoping that he would come back around and want to see her again, but it wasn't working. And Amy was so hurt that she decided she wanted Blake to feel just as hurt as she did. So she went out and did something real messy. She slept with one of his friends. She said she knew that this would be like the nail in the coffin of their relationship and that he wouldn't want anything to do with her after that, but it was worth it to her for the revenge. Some people think that she later turned that painful moment in her life into one of her biggest hits, "You Know I'm No Good." She sang the lyrics, "I cheated myself like I knew I would. I told you I was trouble. You know I'm no good." It's like she used her songs to make sense of all of the chaos and to make sense of her own emotions and behaviours. But even though they weren't together anymore, the two of them were consistently texting and just repeatedly breaking each other's hearts because they weren't getting back together. It was just like constant arguing. And that was all summer of 2005 until everything fell apart. Amy had been spiraling and she'd become reckless. Her house in Camden had turned into a total mess. She was hardly eating. She spent just days on end laying in bed, smoking weed and doing fuck all else. Absolutely everything reminded her of Blake, and she really struggled to leave the house and go to all those places in Camden that they used to go to together. And so for that reason, she did just kind of lock herself in the apartment, but even there wasn't safe. Even things in there reminded her of Blake, like the bloodstains on the walls, because she used to get so angry when they would argue, she would punch the wall. And even though that's far from a happy memory, she just wanted him back. Toxicity and all. She didn't care if it wasn't healthy, she just wanted Blake. Amy started drinking from the moment she woke up on a morning to the moment she passed out on an evening, and once again, she was overwhelmed by depression. Her manager Nick saw just how out of control she was, and he actually reached out to her parents to see if they would come and help her. But neither of them wanted to deal with it. So all on his own, Nick had to try to convince Amy to go to rehab. He took her to see someone who spoke to her about this program that they had and how helpful it could be for her, but Amy still wasn't sure. She said that she would actually only go to rehab if her dad thought that she should. So she went to go and visit her dad and speak to him about it, and when she got there, she curled up in his lap like a little kid again. She was so vulnerable and so worn down by her current situation, and she just wanted her dad as a daddy's girl. She just wanted him to fix everything. But when she went there and spoke to him, Mitch thought that she was fine. Didn't think she needed rehab. Many people have accused him of making this decision because if she was to go to rehab, then that would halt her career. It would mean less money, less appearances. And you'll see as we go through this story, it really does seem that Mitch Winehouse seemed to value Amy's career and her profits higher than he did her well-being, in my opinion anyway. But either way, he said that he didn't think she needed to go to rehab, so it was also a no from her. She would continue down her self-destructive path. And it was around this time that she would start writing one of her most famous songs ever, Rehab. They tried to make me go to rehab, but I said no, no, no. And you know that line, "If my daddy thinks I'm fine," that's about Mitch. Well, obviously. But it was about Mitch enabling her addictions and her self-destructive behaviour. And that puts such a different spin on the song. I've never really thought about that lyric too much, actually, and I don't really know what I thought it meant, but now that I know the backstory behind it, it's quite upsetting. I always kind of wondered as well who the they was in that song. They're trying to make me go to rehab, and I was like, I always just assumed it was like her loved ones, but now we know it actually wasn't her loved ones. Her dad was saying that she was fine. It was actually her managers and the people that she worked with that had her best interests at heart, not her own father. Her manager Nick once said that song, Rehab, felt like a complete mockery of their friendship and of what she really needed. She was lightheartedly writing about a decision that Nick believed led to her untimely death just 5 years later. It was a missed opportunity to help Amy, and Nick really worried about how much worse things could get from here, and as we would tragically come to see, things got a hell of a lot worse. Maybe rehab could have changed things for her, maybe not. People do often go in and out of rehab like 2 or 3 times. But if they'd have been able to nip things in the bud as much as possible before her life became even more chaotic and before she got even more famous, then maybe, just maybe, things could have been different. But instead of help and rehab, Amy Winehouse, at 22 years old, was instead flown out to America to start working on her next album. Instead of therapy, she always used songwriting to be able to process her pain. She even said herself that she wrote songs because she was fucked up in the head. By March 2006, she was in New York working on what would become one of her most famous songs ever, Back to Black. And this song was about the deep sadness and despair that she felt after her breakup with Blake. It only took her about 2 or 3 hours to write the whole entire lyrics and the melody for it. Amy completely poured her whole heart and soul into that song, and she was really pleased with the way that these writing sessions were going for the second album. But then she received the most devastating news possible. Her grandmother, Cynthia, had fallen ill. Amy rushed back to the UK to be with her, but on May 5th, 2006, Cynthia passed away from lung cancer at the age of 79. Amy always said that she owed everything in her life to her grandmother, and now she felt lost, knowing that her biggest supporter in the whole entire world was gone forever. After her grandmother's funeral, Amy was plunged into an even deeper depression, to a point where she couldn't even go back over to America to finish recording the album. She stayed in London and did the finishing pieces from there. And one day, while she was in the studio recording, she was obviously going through a hell of a lot at this point in time. Someone at the studio said that they were all drinking that day. Amy had had a few, like a lot, of vodka cokes, and then she'd ordered this massive plate of food, ate the whole entire thing, and then disappeared for about 45 minutes. And when she returned, she looked all red and sweaty and like she was in a daze. I'm sure you guessed, Amy had gone to the bathroom and made herself throw up that whole meal. She was still battling with bulimia, and like I said before, she did for her whole entire life, but at this point it was finally when people were starting to notice. She couldn't hide it from people like her manager or the music producers that would see her eat a whole entire plate and then go off to the toilet. But just like with everything else in Amy's life, it doesn't seem like anyone did anything to help her. But Amy never felt like she was too bad. She never felt like she actually needed help. She always felt like she was in control of her vices and her demons. She knew that she had them, but she thought that she was alright and she could live alongside them. Soon, Amy had completed her second studio album, Back to Black, and it was released on October 27th, 2006, when she was 23 years old. Her song Rehab took over the whole entire world, and now Amy Winehouse was a household name globally. She had transcended Camden and even the whole UK. She was a global superstar. In February 2007, she won the Best British Female Award at the Brit Awards, which was a huge moment for her. And apparently, Amy was almost embarrassed by how well she was doing in her career at this point. Obviously, she'd never been one for all the media attention. I think when she was young and her dad said that she was an attention seeker and that was in the way of singing and performing and dancing, and I think she genuinely always loved that part. But she was never an attention seeker when it came to actual Amy and who Amy was and her privacy. Honestly, Amy thought the whole celebrity thing was just pretty cringe. She would say things like, if I really thought I was famous, I'd just top myself or something, because it's frightening. She really had a way with words, that woman. Fame really was frightening back then as well. I mean, it seems frightening today with cancel culture and the internet being able to like blow things out of hand the way that they do. But at least in this day and age, in a time of the internet and social media, celebrities can at least have their own voice and tell their own side of the story to an audience. But back then, celebrities didn't have that. The paparazzi and the tabloids and the editors would determine the narrative of a situation. They would snap these pictures, these grossly invasive pictures, by the way, and then they would twist them and create a storyline alongside it. Whether it was true or not, they'd create rumours. They would lie about these celebrities just to sell more copies, and celebrities had little to no control over their own narrative back then. So while cancel culture wasn't necessarily a thing, all it did take was one bad photo or one bad rumour to destroy your whole career anywhere. So all in all, the press and fame was a terrifying thing for someone to get caught up in, especially for a girl like Amy, who was only ever in it for the art in the first place. And honestly, Amy did hate her own image in the press. She really didn't like that she was seen as this drunken, disorderly, drugged up, like, liability mess of a person. She despised that people would spend more time discussing what drugs she was on and how drunk she was and rather than her actual music, the 2 albums that she had crafted. But she was slightly embarrassed by how her drunken, intoxicated image reflected on her art. And isn't that just the awful thing about addiction? Amy hated what it did to her and what it did to her career. She hated herself a lot of the time, and the drugs made her hate her own art. But even all of that couldn't pull her away from them. She had been in such a deep hole of addiction with so many different substances for so long that she honestly thought that there was no way out. And besides, as I said before, she thought that she was functioning quite well on it all anyway. After all, she was still writing albums, she was still recording them, she was still doing shows. Well, the problems really started to come when she would perform live, and we'll get back to that later on. But around this time in her career, it really didn't seem to be affecting her in many ways other than the tabloid stories. Just after the release of her second album, Amy went on another massive drug drinking binge where people didn't see her for a while. I think a part of this particular binge was a delay in how she'd processed her grandmother's death. Of course, when she first got the news, she was devastated, heartbroken, but she had had to power through finishing the album, and now that was out of the way, she actually had time to grieve. And because Amy had never been taught how to process her emotions, she'd never done therapy, she'd never had anyone by her side to support her, the only way that she knew was to self-medicate with several different types of drugs. But in the middle of all of this chaos, a familiar face from her past shows up again. Blake Fielder Civil reached out and congratulated Amy on her album Back to Black. And the rest is history. That was all it took for the two of them to rekindle their flame. The two of them always felt like they were soulmates, like twin flames. You know how people talk about like that toxic, addicted kind of love that you can't tear apart. The two of them always believed that they were destined to be together. In fact, in an interview, Blake said that getting back together with Amy took fucking tenacity and perseverance. There's no way we were never going to be together. Thank God Blake wasn't the writer out of the two. What do you mean? There's no way we were never going to be together. Like, I get what he means by that. After 6 months of reconnecting, Blake asked Amy to marry him. And a month later, they sealed the deal. She was 23, he was 24. They flew out to Miami and got married. And they just had a nice little holiday, sailing on a boat, out in the sun, on the water. It was really nice. But it was just them two. None of Amy's or Blake's families were in attendance for their wedding, their marriage. It was literally just Amy and Blake versus the world. It's easy to see why she always felt like no one else in this whole entire world understood her other than Blake, because, well, no one else is there. No one else is ever around her. But I'll be honest, even if the wedding was in the UK, I wouldn't put my money on the fact that her parents would have been there anyway. Amy's mother, Janice, actually never met Blake. In the whole time that Amy was alive, she never met her daughter's husband. Just let that sink in for a second. He had been in Amy's life for years and years and years, so I wonder if this was intentional on Janice's part, because she would still see and catch up with Amy quite frequently. It was just never when Blake was there. But anyway, after returning from Miami, a married woman now, Amy's husband introduced her to heroin and crack cocaine for the first time. Blake had already been using these drugs throughout his life himself, and he thought that Amy might like them too. He knew that she was always trying to numb her feelings and disconnect from the madness of stardom, and he could tell that her self-medication of weed and cigarettes and alcohol just wasn't quite cutting it for her anymore, so he showed her heroin and crack, thinking that he was helping her to fulfill this desire to disappear from everything. But Amy very quickly became addicted to both substances, heroin, crack cocaine, on top of all of her other dependencies that she had. It was all taking a hold of her. In July 2007, during a concert in Cornwall, Amy appeared on stage very obviously high on drugs. And aside from that, she also just didn't look well in general. She had lost weight, which was alarming because she was always a very tiny, petite girl, but now her skin looked tighter, muscles were protruding, and bones were protruding where they hadn't before. It seems that her cocaine, heroin, heavy drinking, and her eating disorder were all visibly hurting her. When she sang on stage that day, she was slurring her words. She kept slapping herself around the face as if she was trying to snap herself out of a drug-induced haze. Honestly, the video is really hard to watch. She was slurring her words so bad that even dedicated fans that knew every word to her songs couldn't make out what she was singing on stage. And the audience were honestly just really disappointed in this show. It wasn't the performance that anyone had expected. And soon, the crowd began to boo at her. After this bad show, things only spiraled. Amy got worse and worse until one day, something terrifying happened to her. On the night of August 4th, 2007, a month before her 24th birthday, Blake called Amy's manager Nick in a panic. He was completely freaked out, screaming down the phone that Amy had overdosed in her Camden flat. So they rushed her to hospital, and doctors said that it was a miracle that she wasn't in a coma right now because she had had so much cocaine, heroin, and alcohol in her blood all at once. Amy was soon nursed back to health and discharged from the hospital, but this incident had really scared everyone. Her friends, her family, Blake, even Amy herself was scared. The media caught wind of this overdose, and of course, the paparazzi were unbearable yet again, to the point where her dad, Mitch, finally did something to help his daughter. Wow. He took her out to a quiet hotel in the countryside. The plan was to take Amy there to just get some rest for a bit, out of the public eye, peace and quiet. In fact, he'd even invited a bunch of Amy's friends to stay at the hotel too, hired them hotel rooms so that she would have this support system around her, people to lean on during this difficult time. But within hours of them all arriving at this countryside hotel, journalists from The Sun, The Mirror, and other media outlets had already booked up every other free hotel room in that building. Amy just couldn't get away from it. Ever. She was never safe. She was never private. The press was always all over her struggles, always writing about how hard of a time she was having. And it just made it all so much worse by them preying on her pain. It's honestly disgusting that they couldn't even allow her that space and time to heal before they started making headlines out of her once again. The press really didn't seem to care that Amy's stardom and her downfall had become the same storyline in the press. And you know what? I wonder who told the press that she was there at that hotel. Maybe they were following her. Maybe there was a rat in her inner circle. I don't know. Something doesn't seem quite right about that. Every conversation that Amy and her friend group were having had ended up in the newspapers. I don't know if their phones were hacked or what. Maybe that's how they figured out that they were in the hotel. I don't know. But somehow the press knew everything. Amy was still recovering from her overdose, and in her own words, she felt terrified at this point in her life. Both terrified for her health and terrified for her inevitable loss of privacy. Everywhere she went, no matter what she was going through, she was now faced with the fact that she was never alone. And not never alone in the good way, never alone in the way that people will never stop watching her and waiting for her to slip up. A doctor came to visit Amy in the hotel and told her friends and family that if she overdosed again like this, she would die. She was very, very lucky that she hadn't died this time, but if her body and her heart was put under that much kind of stress again, then it would kill her, definitely. But instead of getting her the help she needed beyond this point, Amy was told by her team to pack her bags. It was time to go on tour again, this time in America. All of Amy's friends were practically begging Mitch to just cancel this tour and help Amy out. But he couldn't, because this tour was all booked and all the contracts were signed and he didn't want to destroy his daughter's career. But here's where it gets even more messed up. Before Amy was sent away on this big tour, while she was still at the hotel in the countryside, Mitch had arranged for a doctor to come in and do regular checkups with her to make sure that she was progressing and healing. The first time that the doctor came, they did a blood test, and of course it came back completely clean. She had just recovered from that major overdose and she'd been in the countryside hotel ever since. There were no drugs in her system. But later that day, Blake stopped by Amy's room for a little while, and then by the time the doctor next visited and did another round of blood tests, there was heroin in Amy's blood, and we can only assume that Blake had given her it. Both Blake and her father were so incredibly destructive to Amy. Maybe Freud had a point after all. It seems that Amy was drawn to someone with all of the same bad traits as her father. Both men were selfish, with a talent for reappearing in Amy's life just when things start to look up for her. She was just trapped in a cycle where all the men around her were consistently treating her horribly. Mitch, her father, wouldn't let her stop touring even though she really needed to. Her husband, Blake, was literally feeding her drugs even when the doctors said that it was going to kill her. After the hotel stay, when they did send Amy out on tour, of course, everything collapsed, because why would it go smoothly? She's clearly not in any position to be able to tour right now. They ended up having to cancel multiple shows across America and Europe, and the official PR reasoning that they put out was that Amy was just exhausted. She was just that much of a hardworking, show-stopping performer. But, of course, the real story was all over the tabloids. All those photos of Amy drunk and high were still making the headlines. Everyone knew what the truth of the situation was. She wasn't exhausted, but she certainly did need time off and needed help, but for addiction, not for exhaustion. Eventually, in August 2007, Amy and her husband Blake agreed to go to rehab. This was huge that they were even considering it. But they had one condition. Amy and Blake both said that they wouldn't go unless they could go together. Now, a lot of doctors had an issue with this because they felt like this relationship was as much of a problem for the two of them as the drugs were. They were both keeping each other in this life, and they needed a break from each other, as well as a break from the substances. But no matter what kind of professional opinions they got, Amy and Blake were not budging. They were not going to rehab without each other. And so Amy's management and her father, Mitch, were like, fuck's sake. So they go out and they find this rehab company that is willing to take both Amy and Blake at the same time. But it seems that she was only in that rehab for a couple of days. And a couple of days versus a lifetime of addiction, pretty much. It was never going to do anything worthwhile. On August 18th, 2007, just 3 days after leaving rehab, Amy was photographed by paparazzi once again with black makeup smeared all across her face. She was all bruised and very clearly intoxicated. It turns out that as soon as Amy and Blake had gotten out of their 3-day rehab stint, they'd gone on a huge drug binge. And that night turned very ugly and very violent. At one point, Blake broke a bottle and cut his arm, and we don't know whether that was intentional or accidental or whatever. I have a feeling it was intentional, because then Amy grabbed the bottle from him, and this time she intentionally cut her arm, and she looked at Blake and told him, I'll do anything you do. The next morning, the tabloids splashed a shocking photo of Amy across their pages. She was wearing blood-soaked ballet shoes. She had bruises on her neck, bandages on her arms, makeup smeared all over her face. But it was the blood-soaked shoes that people found the most interesting. In fact, a lot of people speculated that this could have been evidence of her injecting heroin between her toes. And then things got even worse. Blake, who was now 26 years old, went out one night, got super drunk, and ended up assaulting a pub landlord. Like, got into a fist fight with this guy. He actually punched the fella so hard that he needed surgery and he needed metal plates putting in his face. So it was a fucking beating. And afterwards, Blake actually tried to bribe this man to not take it to court. He offered him £200,000. I'm presuming that was Amy's money, because where was Blake getting that kind of money from? On November 8th, 2007, Amy and Blake were just sitting in her flat in Camden when it was raided by the police. They were looking for Blake. They wanted to charge him with trying to pervert the course of justice, which I presume is because he tried to bribe that guy not to take him to court. Blake actually ended up being sentenced to 27 months in prison, both for trying to fix the trial and bribe the guy, and for the actual assault itself. So 2 years. 2 years and a bit, although I don't know how much he actually served of that, but he was locked up for quite a while. And when he did go away, Amy got horrifically bad again. She wasn't leaving the house, she was barely eating, she was drinking herself to sleep and just wallowing in bed all day, every day. She really struggled with the sudden cold loneliness of Blake no longer being around. And her father did try to help her actually, a little bit during this time. He visited her a few times at her house to try to cheer her up. Again, he offered to send Amy to rehab, but she refused, as always. And with that, Mitch kind of stopped trying. Mitch has said several times in interviews that it got to a point where he just felt like it was Amy's own responsibility to get herself better. But her management didn't agree, and they decided to intervene this time. On the 24th of January 2008, they actually had Amy sign a contract stating that she would never write another record again or perform live ever again unless she got clean from all of the drugs. And now that her career was on the line, she did it. At 24 years old, Amy checked herself into rehab, and this time she was alone. And this time, it works. She was in rehab for about 2 weeks, and when she got out and she was clean, Blake was still in jail, and he was gonna be for quite a while, and I think this is what made the world of difference for her. For once, she actually had a fighting chance of staying sober without his influence every single day. And now that she was clean and focused on herself again, Amy was just going from strength to strength. On February 9th, 2008, she was nominated for 8 Grammy Awards. Unfortunately, Amy couldn't actually attend the Grammy Awards because they're held in LA and her US visa had been rejected. We're not entirely sure why, but we can probably assume that it was because drugs and alcohol were so intertwined with her image. And the photos of her in the tabloids where she's covered in bruises and she's bleeding everywhere, I mean, I don't know. It's not a good look, is it? But the point is, she wasn't in LA for the Grammys. Instead, she was across the ocean in London. It was around 2 a.m. And she watched the event in a jazz club called Riverside Studios, along with her bandmates, her friends, her family, her manager. And in the footage from that night, Amy looked so much better. She looked so good. She looked healthier. She seemed to have a clearer head. The way that she was speaking, words were coming out of her easier. She just seemed to be overall in such a better place. That night, she won 5 Grammy Awards, which at the time was actually the most ever won in one night by a British female artist. But her biggest win of the night was for Record of the Year for Rehab, which is insane. This song that had encapsulated all the lowest points of her addiction had actually managed to bring something so special into her life. And just so that you have an idea of what she was up against for Record of the Year that year, the other nominees were Irreplaceable by Beyonce and Umbrella by Rihanna, and she won it with Rehab. Honestly, one of the best songs ever made, I will say. Amy was finally in an amazing place. She'd quit using drugs and she was winning the most prestigious awards in the whole industry. But apparently, while she was on stage that night accepting her award, she whispered, this is so boring without drugs. But it wasn't long after the Grammys that Amy went back to the drugs. She was always just trying to disappear. The exact timeline is unclear, but it seems that she relapsed just a couple of months after the Grammys. And while we're not sure what triggered her to start taking drugs again, probably the pressures of fame and the constant media scrutiny. It made it incredibly hard for her to stay sober when she felt so overwhelmed and so scared and daunted all the time. But now that she was taking drugs again, Amy was jeopardizing her whole entire career. Remember, she had signed contracts with her record label saying that she wouldn't take any more drugs, she wouldn't do any of this shit, otherwise her contract would be scrapped. She wasn't just gambling with her career, she was gambling with her life too. Remember what the doctor said, if she overdosed again, it would be the end of her. And by now, Amy had zero patience left for the paparazzi rats that would follow her everywhere she went. Actually, by now, she was getting into physical altercations with them. She was fighting back against them, shoving their cameras out of her face. And by this point, when she performed, it was more likely to be a bad show than a good one. She would get so drunk and so high that she would forget her own lyrics. She would be slapping herself around the face, and it made everyone so uncomfortable. And the worst part is, Amy knew that things were wrong, and she really wanted to get better, but she was so exhausted from trying and failing so many times, maybe she didn't ever believe that she could fully recover and live a normal, happy, healthy life. In February 2009, when she was 24 years old, Amy flew out to St. Lucia. She was only supposed to be staying for a week just for like a well-deserved break, but she ended up staying there for about 6 months. And I actually think she extended this trip because she was thriving. In St. Lucia, she'd done with all the hard drugs, I think probably because she didn't really know how to get them, but whatever the reason, she'd stopped them. Although there was that drug-shaped hole in her life that she was now filling with an excess of alcohol. It was like she'd gone from one vice to another. But even if she was drinking a lot, she was actually making so much progress in other ways. Obviously when it came to the drugs, but also when it came to music. Again, like she was actually writing songs and enjoying the process. And she was also just enjoying life at this point in time, and it had been so long since Amy had just enjoyed life and it not been because she was really high on some drug. She was out swimming in the oceans and writing music on the beaches, and I genuinely think that is the kind of life that Amy Winehouse would have thrived in. One where the paparazzi can't get her, you know? And in St. Lucia, for that 6 months, it wasn't paparazzi proof, but it was so much more peaceful than life in London ever had been. But after a few months of this paradise, her dad shows up in St. Lucia. And he's not alone. But it's not friends or family that he's brought with him, not even Blake. He had actually brought a whole camera crew with him. He said that he was making a documentary about his life, which, what the fuck? Obviously the documentary was going to be more about Amy than it was about him, because with Peace and Love, who is Mitch Winehouse other than father to star Amy Winehouse? And Amy herself saw right through this. She felt like her dad was just doing this for a bit of money or for his own ego. Of course, she didn't want a camera crew in her face right now. But she didn't tell her dad to leave. She allowed him to stay and the camera crew because after all, she did love him and she wanted him there. She hadn't seen him in ages and she was finally happy and like, whatever, she didn't want to ruin it. So in comes this fucking camera crew. When Amy returned to London that summer, Blake was just being released from prison, and it seemed for the first time like ever, Amy could actually see how much better her life was without that man in it. The moment he got out of jail, he actually filed for a divorce, which really took me by surprise when I was researching this. Their marriage would soon be over, and it was all because he had seen tabloid photos of Amy in St. Lucia getting close to another man on the beach. So he divorced her. And I'm not entirely sure how Amy felt about this. I'm sure she was quite torn up about it, but I think long term she had realised already that Blake wasn't good for her, and she realised that there was more to life than just Blake. And around this time, it really felt like Amy Winehouse had entered a new chapter of her life. She was single, she was sober, well, sober from hard drugs anyway, and she was happy. By 2010, Amy had grown really close to her bodyguard at the time, a man named Andrew Morris, and he was like family to her. She would confide in him about the deepest, darkest parts of her life, like her bulimia and all of the effects that it had given her. Of course, she'd suffered with it for so many years, over 10 years at this point, and it had taken a lot from her. She no longer got periods, she was infertile, she would never be able to have children of her own. And these were things that would cross her mind every now and again. Things that she never really used to bring up to anyone else because she didn't want to bother people, or she felt like people wouldn't be sympathetic. But her bodyguard just understood and listened, and for the first time ever, she had something of a therapist. This man was so good for her in so many different ways. Like, for example, whenever Amy wanted to hit the pub on a night and she had a show the next day, her bodyguard, Andrew, would tell her no, that she couldn't go. And she would get the huff, obviously, she is Amy Winehouse after all. She'd get moody with him, and he would just say to her, "You'll thank me tomorrow, you're not going to the pub." And you know what? She would always thank him the next day. She realised very quickly that this man knew what he was talking about and he wanted what was best for her. All this time, Amy had just needed someone to say no to her when it was in her best interest. She just needed support. And it's so sad that no one around her, of all the people that claimed to love her, none of them ever had her best interests at heart. By March 2011, things were looking up. Amy was 27 years old and feeling the best that she had felt in a very long time. She was going weeks at a time without a drink at this point. She wasn't on any of the hard drugs, and it genuinely seemed like she was really turning her life around. But her doctor had found some very serious health concerns that had been caused by her bulimia and her drinking and her drug use. She might have felt fine, but her heart was in extreme danger, especially if she was to start drinking again. But despite these health scares, the positive changes that Amy had made in her life were very visible, and it made people think that she was ready to go on tour again. And for some reason, they made her first tour a whole fucking European tour, which is just insane to me. Why didn't they ease her into it and just do like a couple of UK shows or something? Why are they flying her around the whole of Europe? Amy agreed to go out on tour, but she wasn't looking forward to it. In fact, she was really nervous. She didn't want to do that whole thing sober. She'd never done it before. And actually, I think it was that fear, that anxiety, that led her to take drugs again. Not just drugs, but she was also drinking heavily. All the things that doctors told her not to do, or she would die. Then everything unravelled when she landed in Belgrade in Serbia on July 18th, 2011. She was scheduled to perform that night, but she was adamant that she didn't want to go through with it. But, you know, she didn't really have a choice. They'd already sold all the tickets, all the audience were literally waiting there in front of the stage for her. So, because she had to go on stage, even though she didn't want to, she decided that she was going to make things easier for herself and get as drunk as she possibly could so that she wouldn't feel anything out on stage. When Amy actually went out to that crowd, it was insane. Like, she did so much unhinged shit in the space of just like a few minutes. At one point, she took her shoe off and threw it at someone on stage, I think like a band member. She was refusing to sing. Like, the music was playing and it would be her cue to go into the verse and she'd just be there like... She seemed really disinterested. Like, she was spending a lot of the time, like, looking at her tattoos like this. And for a lot of it, she either wouldn't sing the lines at all, but if she did sing them, she was singing in this, like, really weird voice that didn't sound like her at all. She just looked so lost and disconnected and so fragile, both physically and mentally. It was a disaster. The whole show, the whole thing was just awful. She ended up being booed off stage by her own audience that had bought tickets to see her. And that was another rock bottom moment for Amy Winehouse. After that disastrous performance, her management cancelled the rest of the tour, and at the time, no one knew that that terrible show in Belgrade would actually be Amy Winehouse's final performance. Then, 3 weeks later, everything suddenly went quiet. When someone you love is suffering from addiction and you've tried everything, it gets to a point where you're just waiting, like hoping and praying, in fact, that they will reach out to you and ask for help. Amy's friends who loved her were hoping that they would get that call from her any day now, that she was ready to save herself and to turn her life around. But instead, they received the other phone call letting them know that it was too late for Amy. On Saturday, July 23rd, 2011, Amy Jade Winehouse was found dead in her Camden flat by her bodyguard, Andrew. It seemed that she went to sleep in her bed the night before and just never woke up again. Andrew first went in to check on her that morning at 10 a.m. and she seemed like she was just asleep, so he left and let her sleep in a bit longer. 5 hours later, he goes in again to actually wake her up this time, and he realizes she hasn't moved a muscle. She was in the exact same position as she was 5 hours ago. When he went up to shake her, he realized that she wasn't breathing, she had no pulse. And so he called 999 as quickly as he could, but it was already too late. Amy had died at the age of 27 from alcohol poisoning. And there's actually a video of her dead body being transported out of her house in a body bag. And even after she's died, the paparazzi flashes still don't stop. They're still taking their final photos of Amy Winehouse to put all over the papers. 3 days later, her funeral was held, and it was attended by everyone that knew and loved Amy, apart from her ex-husband Blake. Fans of hers left candles and letters and flowers outside of her house. Some of them even left cigarettes and alcohol bottles as a tribute. After her death, her parents established the Amy Winehouse Foundation to support young people that are struggling with substance abuse and mental health challenges, just like their daughter. They want to be able to support young people, give them the support that their daughter wasn't given by anyone, including them. I found that quite interesting, honestly, because everyone that claimed to love Amy let her down. Apart from her bodyguard, I guess, he seemed like a really good egg. Everyone just always acted so shocked when Amy would spiral back into her darkness and substance abuse, like it wasn't inevitable, given the fact that she was never shown any support. In the last months of her life, Amy spent most of it just locked up in her bedroom drinking. She was drinking so much, but not to get drunk. She was drinking to disappear. When she died at the age of 27, newspapers everywhere announced that there was a new member of the 27 Club. She was one of 4 members of this club that had drunk themselves to death at such a young age. A lot of members of the 27 Club were struggling with different addictions, drugs and alcohol throughout their very short lives. The price of fame had just become all too much. But drugs and alcohol are never the whole story. As we've seen from Amy, external forces, including toxic relationships everywhere she looked, meant that she died 100 times before she tragically passed away. Blake, the husband she would have died for, Mitch, her dad, who often had his own agenda, her management, who were making way too much money out of her to ever tell her to stop all the drugs, and they pushed her to keep touring even when she was dying inside. People were always around her, but it always seemed that Amy was struggling all on her own. No matter how many times she poured her true feelings into her music and asked for help, no one came. We've listened to Amy's music for generations, but perhaps none of us have ever truly listened to what she was trying to tell us. And that is all we have on this episode of Freaky Friday. If you or someone you know is struggling to similar things that we've talked about in this video, then you can visit the Amy Winehouse Foundation website. We're going to link it in the description of this episode. And there you'll find a list of different organisations that help people with a bunch of different things, including eating disorders, substance abuse, or just general mental health challenges. And of course, if you can, donations to the Amy Winehouse Foundation, I'm sure would be very much appreciated. Thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can get 55% off of your first order by using the code 55Eleanor at checkout. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch another video of mine, there'll be one on screen right now, or if you want to subscribe to my channel, click the circle with my face in, because we post new content every single week. Make sure you've got your notifications on as well so you don't miss them, I guess. Bye!